Okay, so before we get to Dirk, I want to introduce Furman, who is the managing director for Bosch's Chicago Connectory. And maybe Furman, you can tell us actually first a little bit about yourself, and then what Chicago Connectory is all about.
Absolutely, and I hope everyone can hear me. As Hans was saying, the connection was a little bit finicky right now. So this is part of the learning experience, using different platforms for all these different meetups. But we always find solutions, so that's always good. So my name is Fermin. I have been working with Bosch for about 21 years in different places in the world and in different types of projects. But a common thing for me has always been project management and innovative projects. So 4 years ago, we opened the Chicago Connectory, which is a co-creation space and community. And that the reason Bosch decided to invest in such a physical space, and now obviously with the pandemic very virtual in many ways, is because we wanted to expose our Bosch associates and also the startups and the other groups like the ones Hans was mentioning just a moment ago, so that we can feed with ideas into the Bosch innovation ecosystem as well. So we have been open for 4 years. We have a mentor platform, so we do very similar things to what the IoT Hub Meetup is, and we are also focused on IoT. So I would say clearly that thanks to the introduction that Dirk made between Hans and myself, we can consider that the community is growing around IoT, and the Connectory is very happy to be part of this big effort. So we have similar goals, and I'm very happy to answer more questions about some of the things we do, like more events. You can follow us and follow our newsletter, and I'll be available for any questions in the table. So very nice to meet everyone. I hope we have a chance to meet again in future meetups. So nice to, and thanks for the invitation, Hans, to this talk today.
Thank you, Furman. Yeah, we'll be doing more joint events, and we'll talk a little bit about hopefully maybe later or somewhere in the talk about the AIoT user group and what we're trying to do together. But before we can talk about that afterwards too. So Dirk, it's my honor to introduce Dirk. So we've been talking about this for a while. In fact, I reached out to Dirk last year when they launched the framework, and yeah, I mean, I think it's been quite a while. It's been almost last September, and one of the things that was that took me was, when you're doing projects like this, there's a lot involved beyond just the technology, and frequently that knowledge is stuck inside of companies or a lot of times inside of SIs, and this effort actually, I think, opens up a lot of these best practices, right? Everything from, as you'll see, how do you start a project? How do you create a business model around this stuff? So with that, I want to introduce Dirk. Maybe Dirk, you can tell us a little bit about, before we get into the main presentation, a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, definitely, Hans. Really great to be here with you all tonight. Actually, it is tonight because I live in Berlin in Germany, and it's nearly 10 p.m. where I am. So it's a nice evening entertainment activity for me. I've been in the IT space now for about 25 years, if not more. So my background really is in computer science, building large and very large scale distributed applications in a number of different industries, from banking to telco to aviation and airline management, and spent a lot of this time actually working with startups, having large companies as clients. And then about 10 years ago, I was on the management team of a startup in Berlin that got acquired by Bosch. And since then, I've been part of the core team at Bosch that is enabling our different business units with digital solutions, which at Bosch really means IoT, or meant IoT for, let's say, the first 10 years nearly. And nowadays, actually, we have merged IoT with AI to be AIoT, but I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute and where this came from. Yeah, Hans, as you said, so I mean, one of the things I'm currently doing together with the team is to build up this AIoT community, and I'm really glad that you reached out to me last year, like you said, because it's been a fun ride since then, and it's going to be also fun tonight. So yeah, thanks for having me.
No worries, and thank you for being up late and taking the time to do this. So, but otherwise, I'll leave it to you, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Hans. Yeah, so we said, Hans, that I would spend now the next 45 minutes to give an overview of this open framework for AI and IoT, or AIoT, as we're now calling it these days. This will be a little bit, well, there's a lot of stuff, and I want to give you an idea. We have actually taken this now and created a 3-day training course from it, the AIoT Masterclass. Yeah? So tonight you'll get 3 days crammed into 45 minutes. I'm trying to make it as entertaining as possible, and please do ask me questions in between. Yeah? And then after this, as you said, Hans, we have half an hour for networking, which I'm also looking forward to. Let me just share my screen. Is that working? Can you see my browser?
Yep.
No, just working, yeah, for me.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm at the site aiotframework.org, which I'm sure we'll share with you in the chat in a minute as well. And this page is basically now making the AIoT framework available. So when we say framework, we don't mean hardware or software. This is really about best practices, or, well, let's say at least good practices, right? So we've been working with a lot of experts in Bosch, yeah, but also many other companies, OEMs, but also other industries to put this together in the last year. And in this image, you can basically see what it is we're trying to do. So we're trying to look at AIoT, which is very much about physical assets, making them intelligent, connecting them to the cloud, potentially using digital twin for better managing all of this, and then also adding what we're calling swarm intelligence, that basically applies intelligence to entire fleets of physical assets. And so I'm working for Bosch, so does Furman. I've been with Bosch now for 10 years, and there hasn't been a single day when I found something new and think like, wow, cool, this is also something that we're doing. But to be honest with you, at the big company at Bosch, to be really on the radar, you have to make, let's say, $1 billion revenue and something for it to matter, right? So I think the big challenge is, how do you go, from your soldering and GitHub hacking type of exercise in your little lab to building something that scales in terms of, obviously, number of devices and scaling technically, but also scales from a business model point of view. So how do you make sure that you build something that people actually really want to have and that they're willing to pay for, and then put all the great technology to make it work? So this is why, well, not so surprising, we're basically saying, okay, for this, we need to look at, what kind of business models can AIoT, so the combination of AI and IoT, enable? How do we then actually really create a design for this? And then something that a lot of people underestimate, how do we go about sourcing this? Because an AIoT solution, very often, this is not only about taking your credit card if you're a startup and just, buying 2.5 kilogram cloud from Amazon or Microsoft or Google, but this is potentially about hardware manufacturing, and so on. So sourcing becomes a big deal, and then co-creation also plays a big role, because what we do very often is complex, and not even a company as big as Bosch can do everything on its own. So co-creation is really important. And then last but not least, this is very much about building this and operating it. And so in the remaining 20 minutes, I really want to talk about all of these things a little bit. A lot of you guys are experts in all of this. So maybe you will not discover something in here which is like completely brand new or rocket science or hasn't been done before or so. But what we've seen is that in order to succeed in this type of product endeavor, or solution endeavor, you really have to create a common language between all the different stakeholders involved. And I think this is maybe the biggest value that we're adding here with the framework. So let's go in here at the top. So let's just really briefly look at the AIoT definition. So as I said early on, I've been with Bosch now for the better part of 10 years in the IoT arm. And I think a lot of big companies, you have this silo phenomenon, right? So you have siloed organizations, siloed business units, and also siloed technology units. So obviously there is the IoT silo, and IoT folks are all about sensors and gateways and different types of networks and connecting stuff to the cloud, and maybe building a digital twin and doing some enterprise application integration to get it all to work. And then when you ask these folks, well, so how do you do AI? Well, it's kind of like, I don't know. We'll just slap it on. And then vice versa, if you go to the AI experts, so the other silo, they will tell you everything about the beautiful algorithms and how to make them robust and how to avoid adversarial attacks and these kind of things. And then if you ask them, well, but if I need to do this at the edge, so how do I do this, and how do I connect this to a sensor? And then they will go like, okay, here's a phone number for these other guys, the IoT guys, so call them and they might be able to help you. So at least that was a situation that we found, and because we wanted to basically address this, we said, okay, if we really do this together, it's AIoT, and AIoT for us means it's not the type of AI, for example, that you would do for Facebook or Credit Suisse. It's AI that's related to physical assets, and it's also not IoT where you do remote condition monitoring or maybe even some, pretty nifty analytics or so. It's really IoT with the real AI, right? So you all know AI is for PowerPoint, and ML is for Python. So we don't mean the PowerPoint type of AI. So we really want to look at the real AIoT, where this comes together. And we really start by understanding what are the different types of scenarios and use cases that you look at. And
Dirk?
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like stop sharing.
Oh, let me share again. Do let me know if this happens again.
Yeah, sometimes there's a little X that pops up in the middle of the screen, and if you accidentally hit it, it stops canceling. I mean, it stops the sharing. Yeah.
Okay, but you can see my screen again now, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I was just here back at the main page, and I was clicking on this here, the AIoT scenarios and use cases. So we spent quite some time, and I know Hans, you and I, we spent some early mornings or late nights, depending on whose perspective you look at it. And eventually we realized this really is about two very different types of scenarios that you should not really, or that you at least need to understand what they are and how they're different. So the one scenario, the first scenario, we have called the digital OEM. Can you still see the screen, Hans?
Yes, yep.
Okay, excellent. So digital OEM, right? So OEM, being somebody who actually manufactures physical products, and obviously has its own traditional supply chain here in terms of hardware component suppliers. And then on the other hand, we have the software as a service that's running on all these different platforms. And if you really glue this together using AIoT, you get the digital OEM, right? So with all these business models, from data-driven business to digital add-on services to asset as a service. So BMW just announced, for example, that in the future every BMW will have a seat heating built in, regardless of whether you buy it in the beginning or not, and then they will add it as a digital service. And like all these other ideas that people have. And obviously in this industry, some companies like a Tesla or an Apple are seen as pioneers. But basically everybody else in the industry is now following. So every OEM wants to become a digital OEM these days, right? And for good reason, because it not only helps with improving your EBIT margin, but also promises you to take the land of your wet ARR dreams, the annual recurring revenues that are so hard to come by for traditional OEMs. So what does it take? Well, on the surface, it's relatively easy. It takes manufacturing and software development skills. And oops, what you get are smart connected products. So what's in our definition a smart connected product? Well, it's smart because it either applies AI to the asset or physical product or equipment, whatever you want to call it. So that's the what we would call product intelligence. And then obviously, we have the cloud component where we have the swarm intelligence. So all of this is connected. And that basically gives you a smart connected product. And there's examples like a basic robot vacuum cleaner that has an AI component on the asset. There's examples like a kitchen appliance that's collecting information from the appliance in the cloud to make recommendations, blah, blah, blah. There's examples, windshield wiper control. Tesla, for example, decided not to add a dedicated sensor for measuring the weather conditions in front of the car to control the speed of the wipers, but rather use data from the front camera and an AI to actually figure out what the weather is and then control the speed of the wipers. Failed miserably in the first iteration, but because they were one of the first OEMs to actually also enable OTA and OTA over-the-air updates, not only for firmware and software, but apparently also for AI models, they were able over time to improve this, right? So another example here is not the improvement of the digital features, but the improvement of the physical product, right? So say you are driving your Porsche at like 160 miles an hour would be 200 kilometers an hour, I guess, on a German highway at heavy rain. You basically need a kick-ass windshield wiper motor that can deal with this kind of situation. So our colleagues are constantly optimizing the products, and AIoT helps them to get the data from how the product performs in the field and then use it to improve the next generation of the physical product, right? So am I still there? Hans, am I still in the?
I see you again. You were off for 1 second, but you're back.
Okay,
Yep.
I'm back now. So
it's not sharing anymore.
It's not sharing anymore.
Yeah.
Okay. You can hear and see me again?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so another example, I really love this one. So this is an industrial tightening system. Looks like you could buy it at Walmart, but the cost price, I can't remember exactly, but something like more than $5,000 because it actually has an industrial tightening control system on it that really gives you full control over each tightening process. So if you're in an industrial environment where we have customers who do more than 100 million tightening processes per year, that gives you great control over each individual tightening process using the product intelligence, and then also applying swarm intelligence to make recommendations how to, for example, deal with a problem. Yeah, whether it's enough to just take a new charge, you actually have to take the work product off the line to look deeper into it. Blah blah blah. Yeah, so lots of intelligence built in. Pretty cool thing. So if I take all of these different examples together, yeah, it becomes clear from the digital OEM's perspective, this is very much about aligning the product lifecycle with the customer journey at all stages, yeah, from the very beginning where you make a purchase decision to obviously the usage decision. That's not only limited, of course, to AIoT related data from the field, yeah, but also the famous Elon Musk asking you via Twitter what you want. But this is, I think, where OEMs in general want to go with their products. And then obviously being able to add digital services, continuous provision of product improvements, and then obviously also, getting product intelligence to see how the product is used in the field. And I think when you're a product designer, when you're a product manager, yeah, one key decision that you have to ask yourself always is, well, this new feature that I want to build, do I want to build this using software or using hardware or using AI? And I'm assuming a lot of you guys here tonight, you are, bleeding edge type of engineers, and for you this might be completely obvious, but if you look at where the industry is at the moment, right? So I think a lot of automotive folks are now, just learning to spell software-defined vehicle, and that's already a huge transition, right? And now we're going from hardware to software-defined vehicle, and now we're really throwing in AI as the third major pillar. So what does this mean? Yeah, for me, as an OEM, it really means I need to rethink my business models, my organization, the way how I'm sourcing, UX, data strategy, architecture, DevOps, all of these things. And I also need to rethink for the physical product. It makes a huge difference if I'm adding functionality to a physical product by, for example, using a physical button to trigger something, yeah, or actually completely taking this out of the physical product and putting this into an app. Yeah. So really, you need to get the physical product design, the AI, and the IoT straight, right? So this is basically, in a nutshell, the digital OEM perspective. Then we have the digital equipment operator, and I will go faster through this now, so we have a bit more time for the more technical details here. So the equipment operator is somebody who actually has the assets, the physical assets, typically on the balance sheet, as opposed to the OEM, who at least traditionally would sell the assets. Yeah, so he is more concerned about operating the assets on his balance sheet. So he has all kinds of problems for which he hopes combination of AIoT is providing obviously a lot of answers. And yeah, so example here could be, you're a railway company, you're not in the business typically of, you know, developing IT products or something like this. So, but rather you want to go somebody, buy these things, and then, for example, slap sensors onto your escalators so that they can be monitored. But ideally, it's really not something that you would build, but you would have somebody else putting this in, because your main business is operating the railway, operating the train stations, operating the escalators, and then integrating this type of solution into your environment. And loads of other examples, you know. The main difference here is the physical asset design and engineering and manufacturing is missing out here. So this is not your concern. What is your concern is how to take the solution that you're building and fitting it into your existing processes. So this escalator monitoring for the railway company, yeah. How do you make sure that when I get the notification that probably this escalator will break down, that my facility management folks are notified, and that actually somebody really shows up on time to do something about it? That is your main concern. And then, of course, there's another task here, which is important, which is the asset retrofit and site preparation, right? So if you want to roll this out for 500 train stations in one country, that's becoming a big task, right? And then obviously there are hybrid models where, for example, yeah, you would have here an OEM that's selling you the electric vehicles. So he is a digital OEM, yeah, because these vehicles are more and more digital, but he's also a digital equipment operator because he's operating his network of supercharger stations, right? So from that point of view, yeah, there are many different flavors of these hybrid models. I'm not going to go through all of them. Yeah, what we see is lot of differences between this digital OEM and digital equipment operator perspective, and in the hybrid model, you know, you pick and choose, right? How this looks like. And again, due to the lack of time, I'm not really gonna take you through all of this tonight, but I think hopefully it became clear what kind of differentiation we are making here, why this is important, and why, if we're now coming back to the AIoT perspective, a heck of a difference whether you are actually building an AIoT enabled product as a digital OEM versus an AIoT enabled solution as a digital equipment operator. And we're trying to have these perspectives now in the following and everything that we do. I will not bore you with our own understanding of AI, Internet of Things, digital twin, and how it all fits together. Let's briefly look actually into the business model design here. Yeah. So for the business model design, we basically identified a number of different patterns, yeah, how you would basically go about identifying the specifics of an AIoT solution, right? So we're not reinventing the wheel here. So in this, for example, we have a very traditional, you know, business model canvas here that's just adding the AIoT perspective. When we do a solution sketch, the main thing that we just basically say is, well, from the very beginning, you have to differentiate between, you know, what happens with the assets in the field versus what happens in the backend, cloud or on-prem, right? So this also already needs to be baked into your business model as a key perspective, and you need to and then you need to understand, you know, how do you get from the high-level use case and KPIs down to the solution. You need to understand what does the customer journey from an AIoT point of view actually mean. Yeah. So you're very much looking here at the physical asset specific customer journey. What are touch points? So as opposed to a box standard internet cloud cloud project touch points can also be related, for example, to the HMI, right? So you need to understand like how is the user interacting with the physical asset, etc., right? And then what kind of features can you bake into this by utilizing AI and IoT? Again, this is what's making this a little bit special. And then yeah, you need to understand cost and revenues, blah blah blah, all these kind of things. So that's important. Then typically the next thing is you go into product versus solution design. So how do you gradually build up your solution? How do you go from a business model, to build up your Agile Story Map? Let me just come to this here, right? So how does this story map to support your digital product then actually relate to a product and solutions architecture? We typically have multiple different viewpoints: business, usage, data, and functional, including functions enabled by AI, of course. Yeah, and then the implementation viewpoint. And then how do you map this back to your agile product development, right? So let's just take one example here: the data functional viewpoint. Yeah, where this is very much, of course, about the data domains. It's also very much about the service and API landscape. So how do you break down your system to components, yeah, that live either in the field on your asset or in the backend? How do you bake your APIs into this? How do you actually make a decision for converting your high-level business model into components that are inherently distributed? Yeah, so how do you take things like latency and bandwidth into consideration? And that's, again, this might look trivial to you guys, but when you come from one way or another way of looking at this is really bringing two worlds together, right? So when you come from the traditional OEM perspective, then your main focus will be down here, right? So the hardware, the different bus systems, maybe how ECUs and CCUs are now becoming hypervised central computers on the asset, etc. But I think where the music is playing now is actually up here, to understand how do I link my smartphone app to a cloud app, to something on the asset that does something else on the asset, to actually on demand enable my seat warming physically, right? And this is something that really needs to be baked into your design. And then, of course, evolvability plays a big role here, right? So how do you design this in a way that you bridge what can't evolve, mainly the hardware in the field, because it can't be updated, also a lot of the embedded stuff, and even a certain stuff, the edge logic that you deploy. Because even with OTA, it's not as trivial to do updates with a large fleet of assets in the field compared to updating something in the cloud, right? So let me leave these different viewpoints here. I think you get the picture. Obviously, at the end of the day, everything needs to be translated to an agile perspective that makes this implementable, because having an architecture that you can't translate to something that you execute is not worth the architecture. So it's really important to have this mapping here, that the guys who do the stuff can relate to your architecture and vice versa. So that's really important. Now, the next thing is, of course, then, so I have a solution design. Now I need to go shopping, right? So I need to understand, how do I go about, making a decision, how I want to define my supply chain for the different things I need for all of this. I need a sourcing strategy. Do I want a turnkey solution? Do I want to do everything internally, or maybe something in the middle? How does this relate to my sourcing bomb that has all of the AI and IoT artifacts on it? And then, how do I run the RFP process? So, and all of this potentially in an agile way, right? So we have one example here, that we're using. It's a school bus fleet operator that's using AI to manage a fleet of school buses. So how would he basically go about sourcing all of this? What kind of decision would he make in terms of internal development versus turnkey solution? How does he take his AIoT architecture, right? So you have the school bus as the asset, you have AI in the edge, you have connectivity to the backend, you have the fleet intelligence, the AI in the backend, you need to integrate with existing applications, blah, 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 all these things, hardware in it. So how do you, take this, how do you create about combination of software, hardware? I think it becomes more natural, right? So create the BOM and then actually derive a sourcing BOM from this, and then actually, map this type of sourcing initiative to your agile release train, right? So I have folks waiting here wanting to do something in the cloud. So please, dear sourcing people, tell me which cloud to use, and so on. Yeah. Same, of course, for all of the AI components that you're using, and so on. The last thing in here that you should not underestimate, of course, is the legal.
Dirk.
Yes.
Yeah, it stopped sharing again.
Stop sharing.
There's also a question. If you want to, whenever you want to
Sure.
take questions, you can take in
Sure.
between and
go ahead.
while you're going with the sharing. So there's a question. Would love to hear how a framework like this was applied to specific problems of Bosch. Is this a tool used by Bosch to consult with other customers?
It's a great question. So I was really skipping over a lot of examples early on. Yeah. Some of these examples come from Bosch, other examples come from other companies. I'm not going to say that all of these examples were created using the framework, because the framework is still relatively new. We decided to create the framework as an open source thing that's co-developed with many other experts, because it helps us to also make sure that we're not missing out on any best practices from other companies. But yes, of course, we are now increasingly starting to use this for the development of products, yeah, be this our own products, or also in customer situations where we are in a B2B supplier role. Yeah. And I will later on maybe also give an overview, how we are working together in this open framework. But let me really just briefly give an outlook of many other topics that we're seeing, because we haven't touched half of it, right? So the next thing, of course, after the sourcing that you need to look into is what we're calling the Agile AIoT grid, so the idea is, it's a grid onto which you throw all the different things you need for executing this now. So let's assume we've sourced everything we need. So now either we or a supplier, somebody is going into the execution mode. And the biggest problem that we have here is that, cloud folks would typically, be in the continuous improvement mode, yeah, where you're in a very agile way. You start with an MVP and then you improve and you add, etc. That's obviously something we want to retain, the agility, but it's not something that can be applied to everything. For example, that needs to be what we call first time right. Yeah. So something that's deployed on a physical asset which you can't update, or which is critical, safety critical, etc. And how do you get these two worlds of continuous improvement and first time right working together for everything that we see in an AIoT solution? And how do you gradually build up the solution? So there's many different things here. So there's the whole, how do you actually go about the AI part here, right? So how do you develop, how does your AI development cycle look like? Again, we could spend 3 hours going into the details here. And then how does this map with your IoT implementation perspective, where you're basically, of course, you're getting some AI, either edge or cloud, but then you need to stitch it all together, right? So how do you do this in terms of the work streams? We've looked a little bit at the architecture. Obviously, you need data strategy. You need to get your DevOps straight for all of this, right? So you need to take the traditional ops that goes code to cloud, so to say, and you need to understand, okay, now it's also code to edge, but it's also AI models to cloud and AI models to edge. So just very briefly, when you look at this, you have to take the traditional DevOps cycle, and you need to understand how does the MLOps cycle then look like? What happens if you throw in OTA, over-the-air updates, to the physical assets? So how does the integrated DevOps for AIoT then look like? And obviously, you need to understand what does this mean in terms of the DevSecOps perspective for AIoT. So what are the security challenges from an AI, from a cloud, from an edge, from a network point of view? You need to understand how does this look like from a reliability and resilience point of view. So how do you build robust systems for AIoT, right? Because this is cloud, this is highly distributed, this has AI in it, right? So how do you take this type of distributed to the field and the backend type of system with AI on it? How do you rate potential problems? How do you act on them? How do you integrate them in the backlog? And then last but not least, verification and validation. Yeah. So how do you go about making sure that you're building the right product and that you're building it right? So here is where a lot of the hardware-centric thinking people would traditionally really look at a V model for verification and validation. So obviously in this we already need to start thinking, well, what does V model for AI software and hardware look like, and how on earth do we get the V model agile, right? So how do you fit the still partially needed rigor that's kind of embedded in the V model, but how do you make it agile, right? So that essentially for each sprint you go through this and you have the development, but then also all the integration in such a complex distributed system, right? So how do you fit verification validation for AI into this? How does what comes out of the V&V process? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, it stopped sharing again. But there's a few more questions. You okay with answering a question?
Hans, can I say something? Give me 3 more minutes to just finish the overview,
okay.
And then we do all the questions as long as we can do. I just wanted to. So sorry, I don't know when it stopped sharing. So I was just showing here the V model perspective, where you need to add the AI and software and hardware perspectives. Then I was talking about how to make the V model agile. I don't know if you still saw this. And
yeah, I did not see that. Yeah.
Okay. Then I was talking about how do you take this approach applied to AI? How do you then actually look at the output of the AI process again as a black box that's fit into your overall component architecture? That's then again distributed between edge and cloud. And how do you make all of this work together? So how do you really get an agile V model for the different work streams that we were looking at earlier on make work? And what does all of this actually really mean when you also have the hard SOP, the start of production, when the manufacturing of the physical product starts, or the operations of the solution when you're a digital operator, so all of this needs to be take into consideration. And then obviously, last but not least, you very much need to look at leadership and organization in all of this. So how does the organization look like for the digital OEM? Yeah. So how does a product organization look like versus, and then again, there's tons of stuff here. How do you really take a manufacturing organization and merge it with a software organization? And then the other perspective, so we were just starting with the differentiation digital OEM versus digital equipment operator, right? So how does the digital equipment operator organization look like, where most likely you're not going to care so much about how the solution is actually created, but it's much more about, you have 500 trains and each train can only be taken out of business for 1 hour per year in a particular train station. And then when you do a retrofit, you just have 1 hour, so you better not forget this particular screwdriver that you need for doing this, right? And then, how does the digital equipment operator then basically utilize this in his business processes, right? So that's, okay, admittedly, pretty much a brute force overview. Sorry for ramming down so much into your brains at such a late point in time. But I thought I'd really give you kind of like a high-level overview, because there's always a danger when somebody talks about a good practices framework that people say like, "Ooh, yeah, it's 3 slides with a bunch of boxes in between." I just wanted to show you guys that we've been working a while on this, so there's a lot of meat on the bone here. But obviously, it is a 3-day training course typically. But I stop talking now. I breathe. I have a sip of my drink here, and I let you answer the questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna do the share here. Well, first, just feedback. I want to share something that Mike posted in the chat window. He's saying my inner enterprise architect persona is loving this talk. So, yeah, I think a lot of folks who have to work on these projects, I think, can relate. Okay, let's see what questions. When you assemble a minimal viable team to implement the complexity of AIoT, what functional expertise do you assemble to bring out an MVP? Yeah.
So first of all, let me give the feedback. I love this. I hope I have permission to steal this term from you, minimal viable team. I love it. Now I need 5 seconds to think about it, because I don't have the answer right here. I think it very much depends on whether, are you a startup that's really looking at, doing something from scratch and, I don't know, build a smart connected toy, with low level of criticality, versus are you looking at, taking Waymo out of business? Obviously, that's 2 completely different pairs of shoes. And the answer to your question very much depends on, where do you fit in there? The feedback that I got from a lot of people was, obviously, yes, we have this whole, hardware, software. Hardware has much longer lead times. So on the other hand, if you want a software-centric approach, you cannot start without the software people. And then if you include AI in this, everybody now is saying that, yes, it's great to have the data scientists, but if you don't have the pipeline engineers to build, a automated pipeline up for you from the very beginning, then you will not get much out of your data scientists and all of this. So what I'm trying to say, if you're a startup, you might have only, 2 guys, one who is better with the keyboard, one who is better with the soldering iron, being your minimal viable team. If you are embarking on this from the point of view of a larger organization, then your MVP is going to be much bigger. And I sure hope you have somebody from procurement in this as well, because one killer mistake I see over and over again is that you don't. And then you spend, I don't know, half a year doing stuff, and then because you have not brought on the procurement people, you're screwed, because all your ideas are moot, because you can't do it, because Yeah, procurement is not on board. I know that's not a perfect answer, but I hope it helps.
A small extra comment from Fermin here. So also, please make sure you have someone that has an idea of the legal framework in your MV team, because a good idea might stop already when you ask a lawyer if this is possible. So I would definitely consider maybe in the extended team, maybe not in the core team, but in the extended team for sure.
Yeah, so this is super important for me. And actually, in our masterclass last week, I even invited one of the Bosch legal experts for half an hour to talk with us through this. And we have one great guy, yeah, who is, not your defensive type of lawyer, but he's actually very, let's try to find a solution together. And we came up with this. So we were trying to identify what are the legal relationships between the stakeholder and this type of scenario. So yes, fully agreed. You need to map this out as well.
Yeah, that's actually a very important point, because I've been in a meeting where a technical team was presenting OTA to someone in aviation, and they stopped the meeting and basically said, we can't change line of code without getting FAA approval, right? So there is no OTA. So yeah, that's a very important point. Okay. And the other thing I was going to say is it's open source, right? The framework is open, it's available. We've shared the links. If there's stuff missing, if you want to contribute, right, it's all open. You don't get to see these types of best practices.
Hans, can you still see my screen? No. Okay,
no.
I'll just share again. So I just basically went to this part of the framework here, AIoT Unplugged. This is how we work, right? So we have a bunch of topics that we're working on, and we do this via these unplugged sessions. It's, well, not very romantic, I guess, in terms of the setup, but it's a Microsoft Teams meeting and a calendar invite and a bunch of people who care about a particular topic coming together. We discuss what's currently in the framework, we discuss whether we like it or not, and then we make changes to the framework. And yeah, if you're interested in this, time zone wise, we try to balance between Asia and Europe friendly time zones. So if you have any topic that you want to work on or so, check if there's already an unplugged session planned. If not, ask us, and we will set up one if we think the topic is relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So next question. Seems to me there is an important use case missing from this framework after deployment: support, training, and troubleshooting, which I have seen over many years to be common OEM failing or afterthought. Where does this fit into your framework?
Yes.
So aftermarket
super
services.
Important.
Yeah.
So this is why we are trying to take this very holistic perspective here, where it's really important to understand. So a lot of OEMs, and I've seen this actually. I remember 2 years ago, I met one of my colleagues at an airport in the morning on his way to a meeting, and he was nearly crying because apparently his boss told him, well, I understand you've been developing the software now for a year and it's ready. That's great. So let's move on to other things. And hardware people don't understand that software is never ready, right? And that's a huge cultural issue to make sure to understand such a product that has digital features has life on its own, yeah, and it lives after sales. So aftermarket becomes more and more important. So this is why I think this perspective is extremely important. So I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Oh, this is a good one. Bert, how do you reconcile the V model and Agile? Isn't there an inherent conflict of the approach? Yeah, you're mashing up hardware with the software.
Let me just go back to this. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes. And while you're looking for that, Aaron, there's a question: is the class online? Yep, all of this is online, and it's You just go to that URL, or you can just go to aiot.rocks, and that'll get you to both the user group and the framework.
So the question is, how do we reconcile the V model with the yes? So you can still see my screen here.
Yep.
Right? So what we see is that when the V model pretty much says, you come from the requirements perspective. So depending on the complexity of the undertaking and the stability of your requirements, you can do this or you can't. But I mean, typically for an IoT project, you don't start without requirements. So you're not, at least, you need a solid story map that outlines your requirements, right? So I would say that's the first mapping, story map, aka requirements engineering, right? And then typically it goes down to the individual user stories in the backlog. And earlier on, I was talking about architecture, and in particular component architecture. That doesn't go away, but obviously you need to understand, for example, how are my user stories then mapping to my component architecture, right? So I don't know, if I have a user story that says, want to press this button, I need to understand, in terms of my component design, what kind of components does this user story touch, right? And then I'm ideally developing all of this in one sprint. Yeah, so maybe the first sprint is more a design sprint or so, but eventually I have sprints addressing this, and then something comes out of these sprints, and either in the scope of the same sprint or in a dedicated integration sprint, it's a philosophical question, then I need to integrate this. So let's take an example here. I want to develop the smart tightening tool I was talking about earlier on. So the smart tightening tool has one software component or AI component on the tool itself and one in the cloud. So I start here creating the architecture and the API design. Next, I'm basically saying, okay, for my cloud component, I'm developing it, and I'm developing this against an API that has a mock-up or dummy, because the hardware folks are not as fast. But still, this part I can develop and test. Then I'm waiting for the hardware guys to give me a prototype. Now I can basically match my cloud function against the hardware prototype. Yeah, and so gradually I build this up, and I would argue, philosophically, it's not too far off to basically say, develop, integrate, develop, integrate, develop, integrate. Philosophical question in all of this is this one sprint, or is just one leg of the one sprint? So you have a development sprint and an integration sprint, or does one sprint always include the integration? That's, I think, the only really philosophical point I see here. But I mean, question back to you. Can you relate to this? So whoever asked this question.
I think that was yeah, actually, hang on, I'll ask the question. Oh, there you go, Bert. Yeah, Bert, I'd recommend connecting afterwards. But yeah, it's a good question. It is one of the challenges, right, that has to be solved. Okay, two more questions here, and then I have a raised hand. So, are there real-world use cases where you've already carried out the Agile V model approach? Yeah, exactly this.
Yeah. Not by the book and by the paper. So I wouldn't be able to produce a project that says they have followed everything in here by the line. Yeah. But I would argue that we've seen a lot of projects that did a combination of the most widely deployed project methodology on this planet, which is called ad hoc, with what we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would add to that is that I think, Dirk, you mentioned earlier, the framework is relatively new. And if you look at the folks who are contributing, there are a lot of consulting companies who are actually doing these projects, and they're also contributing quite a bit into the framework. It'd be worthwhile talking to them about that too. Maybe they can add some of their examples in here. Okay, next question. Any plans to discuss reference implementations and pointers to tools being used? For example, the V model, the need for formal requirement specification is important for automotive and aviation, etc., but maybe not as common in some other areas.
Yeah. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the people behind this. So we have this editorial board, which gives us.
You're not sharing.
I'm not sharing.
Yeah.
Am I sharing now?
Yeah, it's coming up. It's up.
Okay, so we have this editorial board that, for example, has an actual board member from Bosch, from companies like Ansys, and, for example, Microsoft. So these are, let's say, people who are providing us spiritual guidance, if you like. Yeah. And for example, we are working with Microsoft now on creating one case study that actually shows how this really maps to a Microsoft product landscape, so to say. But what's important for us is that we want to keep this separate, right? So we have a dedicated thing here where we have the case studies. It's not yet perfect. We're still working on some stuff, but we want to make sure that everything that's product and vendor specific is always labeled as a case study where we say this came from one or another vendor, versus the framework itself, which is completely product and vendor agnostic. Yeah. Yeah. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think that this is actually one of the reasons why. So there aren't any other questions, so we can talk a little about what we're trying to do here in North America. So Furman, Dirk, Doru, who I think is still here, and I have been actually looking at launching a community here in North America, just a user group similar to what they have in Germany, and I think Singapore was the second one that they launched. And for this exact reason, in terms of the variations in different industries, one of the things that we want to do here is to actually put more focus on vertical industries where this applies. Right, we'll start with automotive, and I think construction is the next one, but it's for exactly this reason, right? These things change industry to industry, and it's important to understand the differences, because, like my OTA example, a generic technology, horizontal technology, doesn't necessarily work in every 100-year-old industry. So and then so anyway, anything else, Dirk?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I think there's a difference actually between, let's say, the vertical perspective. Yeah, so for example, understanding how AIoT can help with matching the building perspective to the building information model. Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the things we're looking at. How do you use, for example, radar and LiDAR based scanners to do progress monitoring on construction sites, and to create a match-up between the physical reality and the logical digital twin or BIM model. Yeah. So here we see, for example, AIoT playing a big role. But I think this question was more towards, for example, how would the Agile V model and the DevOps stuff that we were talking about early on, for example, work with, let's say, Azure or AWS or something like this. And I think we need answers for both.
Yes, we do. Okay, I think if that's it. There's no other questions. So I just want to talk a little bit about the user group we're trying to kick off here. So today's session was actually really wanted to make a high-level introduction on what this framework is. As you can see, there's a lot of work that's already been put into this. And as I mentioned earlier, if you look at companies that are helping involved, many of them are consulting companies who are using this. Somebody has asked about the class. There's, correct me if I'm wrong, Dirk, but there's companies who are actually taking this model and building consulting services around it, because this is a challenge for every OEM, especially, right? So we're still figuring out what the structure is going to be like here. But if you want to get involved, you can reach out to me. And we'll add you to the list, but we're hoping that we'll actually be able to kick off a group here in North America fairly soon. But in the meantime, you're welcome to check it out. You can contribute. I can connect you to Dirk as well if you need to talk to him directly. And otherwise, hopefully this was a good overview. There is a lot of information in here. So with that, I want to thank you, Dirk, for staying up late. Sorry about the tech problems. And hopefully, you can hang out a little bit if it still works for a little bit of networking anyway. Otherwise, thank you, Furman, as well. And,
thank you, Hans, for the organization. It's Dirk. Thanks for sharing again this topic. It was very useful.